Hello and welcome to Africa Aspirations, your number one podcast on African geopolitics, social and economic issues. My name is Fola Folayan, and as usual, I'm your weekly host on this podcast. And this week, we're going to have an exciting time. You definitely want to tell everybody that you know to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And on the show, as usual, I have the best minds on African issues. Lonzen Rugira joining us from East Africa. Hi, Lonzen.
Fola Folayan. Glad to be here.
Yeah, you always call me with my government name and I love it.
Yeah.
David Hundeyin, our West Africa expert. How are you, David?
I'm great. And you?
Good. Thank you for coming. And today, Levi Kabwato is not joining us. Instead, we have Takura Zhangazha. He's from Zimbabwe. He's a blogger and a Pan-Africanist. Hello, Takura. How are you?
Hi, everybody. How are you? I am well if you're all well.
Yeah, we're good. Thanks for coming. So let's quickly get on with today's conversation. Tensions are rising in the Middle East. And the world, and Africa in particular, can be severely impacted by an energy crisis if that region gets into a full, scale war. With the prices of oil soaring and supply chains collapsing, we also saw something similar happen, with the grain and fertilizer when the Russia-Ukraine crisis started. So the question is, gentlemen, what do you think our exposure is and what risks does Africa face if the energy market collapses? Where do we stand? David, you want to take that first?
Okay, I'll go first. So it depends on which African country or region that is in question here. One man's meat could very much be another man's poison here. In a perfect world, for African oil producers like Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Angola, Algeria, it would be a boon. It would be a sort of oil boom moment, something similar to what happened in the 70s when there was a very similar set of circumstances taking place. There were a lot of tensions in the Arab world, and as a result of the Arab oil embargo, it presented a massive revenue opportunity for Nigeria, which promptly squandered the billions that it made from that once in a generation event. In a perfect world, we could be looking at something like that. But obviously we don't live in a perfect world because in the case of Nigeria specifically, something like, I think the next 2 or 3 years of oil revenues have already been sold in advance. So on paper, Nigeria basically stands to benefit nothing from any tensions if they were to arise. And in fact, you'll be in a very paradox, and this is not just for Nigeria now, this is all of West Africa, will be in a very paradoxical situation where, in line with the spike in global energy prices, West African consumers would also have to face a heightened spike in their energy prices because despite being net energy exporters, we also happen to be very energy poor in terms of our local internal markets, and our local pricing is based on international price relations as against the fact that we export. So in Nigeria, for example, there's a whole lot of social dislocation right now going on because the fuel price has just gone up to, I believe, it's 1,030 naira per litre. In US dollar terms, that's roughly 70 cents, 65 cents per litre. To put in context, this is a country where the national minimum wage or the minimum wage that is currently being paid, not the one that exists on paper, that 3,000 naira is roughly, it's just over $30 a month. So if you're paying 65 cents a litre for energy and your minimum wage is $30 a month, you can do the math and see just how crazy the situation it is. So with an energy shock on the Middle East, and that looks set to worsen. And then for countries for example, in East Africa, which aren't currently any export countries, any countries like Rwanda, which are already dependent on imports for their power, this would also be a very serious situation for them because obviously higher energy prices will translate to reduced growth across board. The only sort of, if you call it a light at the end of it, that I could possibly see, and again, bear in mind, this is me grasping at straws here. The only light at all that I could see is if the East African community oil pipeline, which is being constructed from Uganda, I believe construction is going to start next year. If the construction actually takes place and actually happens on time, and obviously the exports from Uganda are able to start feeding its neighbors, that could go some way toward reducing the price shocks. Some way, not all.
Let me ask Lonzen what exactly. I want to get his perspective because he's the East African here, so he probably would be able to give us, a wider picture. Lonzen, did you hear what David said about, the region?
I am following David, but I'm a bit reluctant to entirely embrace his hopefulness in the situation. I can see the potential for the oil boom in countries like Nigeria, like he said, and Algeria and so on.
No, he actually said that Nigeria would not be benefiting.
Yeah, and the point he's raising is that because these countries export crude oil and they don't have refineries to process, ultimately they will be in a situation of net negative because they have to import, and the global volatility will have to affect them as well because they are importing. So the consumer at the end of the day will suffer, regardless of who is the oil-producing country or not. So we are all in the same basket in this case.
Okay.
Yeah. So which now is my answer for the East African situation. This oil pipeline has been in talks forever, and it's unlikely that we can see the kind of impact out of it in the short term to address that volatility. Now, even if it were to happen, in terms of the lives of the ordinary person, the consumer, it's likely to not change anything as long as there is no capacity for refining the oil. Yeah.
So we don't have the capacity right now, and based off of what is going on in the world, we might not catch up in time to benefit.
Exactly.
Takura, what's your take?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, mainly because of Africa's placement in global politics. And in your own introduction, you mentioned the Russia-Ukraine conflict and how it affected wheat imports into the continent. So any global war affects Africa negatively because we are in the international global trading system, and mainly as recipients, we don't necessarily
produce.
As the previous colleague expressed, we don't export. We have that balance that you were mentioning. We import more than we export. The main thing that we export the most is raw minerals, crude oil in this instance, in the DRC, cobalt, and in other places, lithium. So essentially, Africa's placement within this whole new conflict, oil question is not really one in which we can look at it as it has advantages or disadvantages, either for Nigeria, West Africa, or any other oil-producing African country. It's really more a geopolitical question about Africa's placement in the global political economy and how best we can look at improving Africa's positioning in that sort of space. I mean, those are my initial comments, though I do have a lot more to say on top.
All right. I'm glad you mentioned when you talked about how that, in Africa, we tend to export raw materials and then we import refined products, which brings us back to the subject of energy and petroleum specifically. David, I want to come to you because this concerns West Africa, Nigeria in particular. There's always the question of Nigeria's refineries that have refused to function to full capacity, with the exception of the new Dangote refinery. But the question is, why haven't we been able to build more refineries in Africa and even run the existing ones at full capacity so that at least we can limit the damage that this does to our collective economy?
So I think in this case, I not really speak for the whole of West Africa, but I can definitely speak for Nigeria.
Yeah.
And to answer this question, I'm going to recall an anecdote. So I was speaking a few weeks ago. I was speaking to a good friend of mine who works for, don't want to say the name of the company, but let's just say it's one of the world's largest oil trading companies. So there's a list of about 3 companies. So it's one of those companies. I don't want to mention the name, but it's not to potentially betray this guy's identity. And he said, so he's a Nigerian. He's a chemical engineer. So and he works out of the company's HQ in Texas. So I think this was in 2016, 2017. He had this brainwave that, hey, we are doing a bunch of projects, including refinery projects in Ghana. So that at the time, the company was running the Tema oil refinery in Ghana, just outside Accra. And it was like, what we have all this expertise for doing all these things in West Africa. Why can't we do this in Nigeria? So he set up a meeting with his boss, and his boss told him, his boss said, the Nigerians have, and this was with reference to the existing 4 refineries. So the Warri refinery, the Port Harcourt refinery, Kaduna refinery, and the what's the last one? I forget what the last one is. And his boss told him, these refineries, the Nigerians built these refineries since the 70s and 80s. What makes you think that if they wanted these refineries to work, they wouldn't already be working? That was what his boss told him. And so eventually, long story short, after 3+ years of rigmarole, it didn't happen. Right? And then it was the same old story. We started hearing, the NNPC has budgeted so $1 billion for turnaround maintenance of the refineries, and that's where we still are. Right. So from a Nigerian perspective, it is clear, it's obvious, it's visible to the blind and audible to the deaf that there are political interests, local political interests that have an interest in keeping the status quo. Refineries are bad business for these local interests. And since the Dangote refinery came on stream, we started to get some indication as to why that is the case. There are entities that are very deeply connected within the Nigerian government that have significant interests in entities that import fuel from places like Malta.
I was going to ask you about that because Dangote did allude to something like that when there was the whole crisis happening between Dangote and the federal government and NPC. Can you give us a clear picture of what exactly went down? What happened, really?
So here's how the system works. The status quo before the Dangote refinery came on stream, and it's starting to disrupt how that works. So the system that took place was that Nigeria has 4 refineries which were artificially kept redundant. Okay. They never work at anything close to full capacity. So to satisfy Nigeria's daily fuel needs, there need to be imports. Now, as against having a simple willing seller, willing buyer system where an oil trader, comes to the ports, offloads fuel products, they get paid and they leave, and it's as simple as that. Like it's the case in countries like maybe Ghana or Togo.
Yeah.
And Nigeria is this whole convoluted system. So first of all, everything has to go through the NNPC. That's the Nigerian National Petroleum Company, as it's now known. Up to recently, the NNPC had the status of the sole importer of refined petroleum products into Nigeria. So to work as a petroleum marketer, as a retailer, you then had to go to the NNPC and get a sub-license from them to be able to actually get hold of these products. Now, the NNPC is sourcing these products from these shadowy entities that are primarily based out of the Caribbean and Malta, Southern Europe. So basically what happens is companies like Trafigura, I think I can mention that brand name since, they are some of the worst offenders here. Trafigura is a global oil trader. So what happens is these companies have this thing they do in Malta specifically where the grade of petrol or diesel that cannot legally be sold in the EU because the sulfur level is that high, or there are other toxic
chemicals in there.
And maybe it's too expensive to get rid of those toxic chemicals. That petrol, that diesel, that kerosene, that gets sent to West Africa. So there was actually a study that was done about this in 2016 where it was discovered that the petrol sold in Lagos and Accra had sulfur content up to 1,000 times higher than the legal limit in the EU. So essentially, all the respiratory problems you can think of are being imported into West Africa via this dirty fuel. And in some cases, if you recall the famous 2006 incident in Abidjan, which also involved Trafigura, they dumped a whole shipload of toxic waste off the coast of Abidjan, and for like 2 weeks, the whole city was smelling of ammonia. Right, and then the thing got taken to court, and then they got fined like a small derisory amount, and everybody moved on from that, even though people actually died. Right, that's how this whole ecosystem works. So, the crude oil from Nigeria or places like Nigeria goes to Europe. They have some major refineries like in Rotterdam.
Gets refined.
Like so they have the grade of refined fuel that is allowed to enter the European markets. And then the dregs that cannot legally be sold in the EU, they then blend them. That's what they call blending, where they blend all these toxic substances together into the petrol or the diesel or the kerosene. And then that is what goes to West Africa. So basically, keeping West Africa that way, keeping West Africa as the recipient of dirty, toxic fuel that kills people is important to that financial ecosystem, because it also costs likes of Trafigura.
So what was Dangote's point? What was the source of conflict?
Well, the contention there was that some of the entities that actually run these blending operations that the likes of Trafigura take advantage of are, entities that are beneficially owned by or beneficially linked to prominent Nigerians.
Okay.
I'm sure I don't need to mention their names. So basically, if you have people who have an interest in maintaining that status quo, and then you have the world's largest single train refinery coming on stream in Lagos, which is then going to refine locally produced Nigerian oil, that's going to take them out of business. That's going to destroy the market. And that's where that whole furore came from.
Interesting. I'll come back to you on that, David. But let's look at this from, a wider perspective. I mean, for some crises, and, for some people, other regions of the world, crises and conflicts, they're like an opportunity, to step up, to reshape the world order and put themselves into certain positions. Where do we stand in all of this? If, as Takura says, we are more consumers and importers of refined products, and all we do is just export the raw materials, do we even stand a chance, in the coming crisis, if we can call it that?
No, we don't. And if you look, it is a structural vulnerability.
Yeah.
That any crisis with the global significance will have Africans as victims. And that's the structure.
That sounds very depressing.
It is the structural vulnerability, and it arises from the way the African economy is structured. And if you look from the 1970 oil crisis, whether it's the oil crisis of the 70s, whether it's the financial market crisis of the recently, whether it is the pandemic, COVID pandemic, all those, Africa faces a structural vulnerability that arises from just the way it is set up in the global system. In the 1970s, I'm going to talk like I was there, but bear with me.
But you were there, were you not?
I was. Bear with me. So, you young people, we have to tell you these things.
Oh, please.
Yeah. So in the early 70s, the oil crisis, global oil crisis, after the war with the Israel and the Arab world. So Africa, for the first time, was affected in such a way that changed its course of history, and that is up to 1970. Africa was operating an economy that was inward looking. Early post independence, it was inward looking until the oil crisis of 1973. The oil crisis of 1970, as our friend Levi tends to remind us, there's a document that aimed to create a kind of economy that was resistant to vulnerability. And this document is called the Lagos Plan of Action. And it is always referred to, and the reason it's always referred to is because it had such significance that it was supposed to build an economy that was resistant to global shocks. So a self-reliant economy.
Yeah.
So that was 1970. Now, in 1980, so 1970, 1973, the oil crisis happens. Now, the Lagos Plan of Action, a year later, after it was put out, the World Bank released a counter document. It's called the Berg Report, BERG. That's the author, but it was a World Bank document that now sought to make Africa an export-oriented, an externally looking market rather than an inward-looking market. Yeah, so
which is the counter of the previous report.
Yes. So now, as a result of that, the African economies were shortly after you have out of that document, the execution of that document is what you have the structural adjustment programs. They arise out of the execution of that document.
Nigerians have a lot to tell you about structural adjustment programs.
Yes, so those programs, they ran all through, and actually we continue to operate from them up to
and that's where we are now.
Yes, but the most important aspect of that was to open up this vulnerability for the African economy. So you have export-led economy from manufacturing. Yeah? So where the Lagos Plan of Action was supposed to promote manufacturing, this one now was to promote export, and that is import to import.
Reliability on imports while exporting raw materials.
Exactly, yes.
Without any sort of infrastructure development to produce.
Exactly. Yeah, so rather than create the kind of market where you have surplus to export, now you're going to have a vulnerable economy where you're going to be importing the essential things that you need. Because you're importing the essential things that you need, you are opening up yourself to the global, to this volatility. And the vulnerability becomes structural. So because the African economy has never changed from then up to today, this is why the vulnerability is structural. So to overcome, you have to reorient the economy back to be internally oriented. So now, one of those requirements was to have reserves. So where you are supposed to mobilize resources, build factories and so on, you have these reserves that each country is required to have at least 6 months worth of reserves to be able to import, right? And they keep this money in the Western banks, Yeah, they are in
the foreign reserves,
Federal Reserve. That's where, and they don't get to enjoy the interest on that money. So anyways, our economies are rigid in such a way that we are supposed to remain in a structural dependence, and this is why even the coming vulnerability, the coming pandemic, the coming crisis, and so on, will continue to keep us in that kind of vulnerability.
I mean, so if we know this, and I'm throwing this question out to Takura and of course David, if we know this, if we have this information, why hasn't anything been done? Why haven't we fixed it? Takura, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can quickly take that. Well, there are two elements to this. When we talk about the global economy, there is the financialization of capital. So we're not really talking about the mineral products, oil or the diamonds. We're also talking about financial markets and how global financial markets are working, stock exchanges, somebody buying shares in a company in the DRC or somebody buying shares in a company in Zimbabwe, for example, where we have an allegation of the discovery of gas, or in Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, where there's also the question of, offshore gas, and the main investors are the French companies, but they're not physically there. It's just trading in shares and trading in financialized capital. So what we have not adapted to largely as Africans or as people in Africa and in the diaspora as well is an understanding that we have to sort of like also be very historical organically about our political economies, where they came from and where they're going. And we have to also sort of stop mimicking political economies of the global north. That is to say, where, like, one thing I've noticed, and this is a controversial point, is where we study business, for example, or economics in an African context, we tend to want to read, your Robert Greens, your Elon Musks, and so on, even Steve Jobs, and people like that. And it's fair enough, we must read them. But we don't want to read, for example, Fanon, Michelle, books that then give us a more contextual nuance as to our political economies, what happened, what's happening, or even Nyerere, for example, and how Nyerere tried Ujamaa as a political alternative. All we do is just we deride that and we say, no, that didn't work, or that didn't, or even in Nigeria's case, the initial oil industry and how it was supposed to be nationalized post-independence, and that didn't happen, mainly because of the global economic capitalist interest in the product, which is then financialized. But I think just to round off this segment, the key issue is to then learn from this history and learn from contemporary examples. And the options that are there for us to deal with, for example, our placement in the global political economy, for now appear to be at least threefold. The first is just to do what is there, follow the global neoliberal path. Capitalism is capitalism, financialized capital is more powerful, join Starlink and stuff like that. The second is then to follow the other alternative with state capitalism, which is largely the Chinese model and the Russian model that creates oligarchs, but it also creates a sort of nationalism where you've got strong nations that feel confident in themselves and distribute their own resources and control their resources. And then the third option is to become more democratic and more people-centered, which is harder because global capital and local financialized capital resists people-centered solutions to questions such as what happens to the Venezuela's oil, what happens to Zimbabwe's diamonds, what happens to lithium, and so on. So we have that threefolded ideological, if you can call it that, dilemma, where we have to really think about what is the way forward. Like you were asking, like why is it like this? But it's also because we're not thinking through it, and we're choosing intellectual paths that are more convenient as opposed to harder. And we're also being a bit too much ahistorical. We want to go with the flow. We're doing TikToks and so on, which is fine. But at the same point, our contextualism is dissipating, and our historical contextual applications to where we can be as Africa, whether we're in the East, the West, the North, or as I am in the South, we then lose track of where we can go. I think I'll just stop there.
All right, David, what do you think? Do you agree with Takura?
So yeah, I completely agree with him. I think what I'll add to what he said is I myself would fall into the category of the first person he described. Maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I'd have fallen into that category where, based on everything I'd ever heard and everything I'd ever taught, the world seemed very simple to me. It's all about open borders. Capitalism will
solve everything.
Basically, and just basically do anything that came out of the World Bank, any PDF that comes out of the World Bank, just do what it says, and the kingdom of God shall be shall be well. Basically. Yeah. But over the past 3 to 4 years, I think I've had a very rude awakening. As he said, the most important realization to me as an African with an interest in how geopolitics actually works is that everything has a historical context. And we have a very unique historical context that nobody else has. So the solutions that appear to work for other people are not our solutions. So if you are wasting energy trying to adopt someone else's solution that worked for them, and by the way, this applies not just to the solutions that are adopted by the global north, but even those from Russia and China as well. If you're just trying to ape what other people have done, it probably isn't going to work so well. Yeah. I'm using Nigeria as a case in point, which he touched on. A large part of the reason why Nigeria is where it is, in terms of being a country with a government that has such low state capacity, despite on paper having such a large economy, is precisely because so much of Nigeria's economy was deliberately not just stepped out of the hands of the state, because I don't necessarily believe the state should also have control of the economy, but also even just the capacity of the states to influence things in Nigeria was severely curtailed. Right. So he mentioned the oil industry. Honestly, up until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it would never have occurred to me to ask the question that why does Royal Dutch Shell basically own Nigeria's oil industry? It would never have occurred to me to ask the question because it just seemed like it's an obvious thing. Of course they should. They are the ones who have the expertise. They are doing us a favor by being a joint venture partner, yada yada. But when you now look at the historical context of things, when you for example, look at the background to the 1979 Iranian Revolution and what led to it, and the fact that it was essentially a fight over Iranian oil and foreign interests who thought that they should
have access to it. Yeah.
Right. Should own Iranian oil, that the Iranian people shouldn't own Iranian oil. And and when you now compare that to Africa's context, it starts to sound very familiar that this is the exact same sort of colonial entitlement that we had to deal with for centuries. So this is the context where all of this comes from. And then you start to understand that, okay, so the country I grew up in wasn't anywhere near as free as I thought it was. And the economy I thought I grew up in wasn't anywhere near as, as open to participation as I thought it was, because that's another contradiction that I had to come to terms with. The fact that you have this thing that purports to be a form of capitalism, and it's actually not a free market. It's not a free market at all.
No, it is.
It's a market that has
not a free market.
It's been entirely rigged by a few actors, and it is artificially maintained that way to ensure that people like you cannot get in. But because there's private capital that is present, you call it a free market, you call it capitalism. It's actually not. Or it's a form of capitalism that does not deliver the benefits capitalism is supposed to deliver. So yeah, I completely agree with him in the sense that I believe it's a Ugandan proverb that says that to move forward, you first have to know where you're coming from. Or the proverb was, if you don't know where you're coming from.
I think it's an African proverb generally. Yeah. If you don't know where you're coming from, you don't know. You cannot say where you're going.
There's one I can only say in Kinyarwanda, so
go ahead.
I don't know how to say. I don't know. Just in English. Yeah. So I think everyone is mentioning very important things about reclaiming our economy.
Yeah.
And we began to lose control of our economy from the vulnerability of the 1970s oil crisis. And then from that point on today, we've been able to create private capitalists, but who are just opportunistic and unpatriotic. So
wait, opportunistic and patriotic.
Unpatriotic.
How can that sounds like a paradox.
Yeah.
Can you be both?
No, unpatriotic, opportunistic and unpatriotic.
Third.
So these are the kind of capitalists that have emerged from that context. Where the objective is to extract from the African. So whoever who is doing the extraction is the global capitalists in connivence with African capitalists. So this absence of patriotic favor in the African capitalists, because for them, they are businessmen. I'm just doing business. Yeah. So
but at whose expense
exactly?
Are you doing the business?
Yes.
And at the end of the day, like David used to say, sometimes you think that you're the one in charge of your actions and your thoughts, but you don't know the source of those thoughts. Where are they coming from?
Yes. But business is never business. Business is politics, and politics is patriotism. So this is the difference between the Asian capitalists.
Yeah.
So we find that these people are nationalistic and they are capitalists, and they're pursuing. There is no contradiction. Actually, there is one reinforces the other. So the common good is never escaped, and whenever the common good has escaped that kind of entrepreneur in the Asian context, they are quickly taken into the rehabilitation centers.
That's a very nice way of saying. Rehabilitation centers. Can we call it what it is?
The moment they become opportunistic with the tendency to exploit their people in such a way that is a rugged exploitation, they are quickly identified by the law system, the law in place, the legal framework, and they are. I think we can name quite a few of them that we used to see in the private space, but they are no longer there because they got sucked into that Western model of extraction, where the common parcel, that extraction that has no nationalistic favor.
I mean, talking about billionaires, I'm glad you mentioned capitalists and global businessmen. The other day, we had a conglomeration of global businessmen in this country, in Kigali, on the invitation of Nigeria's biggest billionaire, if one could call him that, Aliko Dangote. Questions have been arising because it was a very hush-hush, quiet kind of meeting, what the agenda on the table was. Do you think his refinery, the energy crisis, the potential energy crisis Africa might face, do you think all of these issues, all these things we're talking about, do you think they were on the agenda to be discussed?
I hope so. In moments like these, you need African leaders. And when we talk about African leaders, we also talk about these businessmen and women with capacity to make a significant contribution. So they need to be able to come together in times of vulnerability, to be able to think together and say, how are we going to work together to address these shocks so that we're able to at least have some kind of buffer. So we have not seen this. When we had the COVID pandemic, we didn't see them come together. When we had the financial crisis, we didn't see them come together. So it is important that African businessmen and women become patriotic in their thinking about business. So leadership that is required of them is not leadership of private wealth acquisition,
which is what we see most of the time.
So they need to be nurtured into patriotic business people. That we require of them leadership, and because we require leadership in business, it means that they need to secure the common good in the pursuit of their business. So they are leaders in their area of. This is the same thing we need to do when we talk about the clergymen, the religious leaders, and so on. They are leaders, most importantly, of African societies. The religion is a vehicle through which to pursue the leadership. The leaders in the political arena. Also, politics is a vehicle for the pursuit of the common good to secure Africans. The same for the business people. So we need to bring the consciousness of these leaders in the different arenas they are in to understand that the survival of the Africans is they have a role to play. First of all, whether you're doing business, whether you're a pastor, whether you are so do your pastoring, but not in a way that is exploitative to the Africans. So how can you be of meaningful value in their spiritual lives? I understand. That's the kind of pastor that we But that only comes when the pastor sees himself as a leader of the community. So now, I think that when you're able to do that, then the pursuit of the state in nurturing the economic environment that is able to address the economic vulnerabilities, then you can have these business people as partners in that pursuit. So the state and business, this idea that the
have to work together.
Yeah, the idea that the private sector is different, is separate from the public sector. Even the people who say it, they don't practice it. It's just rhetoric. When you go and practice, the private sector, actually those rich people are able to survive because of the subsidies of the state that provides them. And it is the state capital that is able to create the private wealth of the individuals. So this idea that the state, the public sector, the private sector are divided.
It's like saying, what you're essentially saying is that the idea of, willing seller, willing buyer, free markets, it can be quite deceptive.
That's the thing, yeah. Those people who preach these ideas, when you look closely, whether they practice them, you find a gulf, a big gulf there. They don't. They don't. The state and the entrepreneurs, they are inextricably linked. And
together.
When Africans, we go to copy what they do, and we copy what they say, not what they do.
David, what conversations should we be having right now? This is a final word from everyone. So I'm coming to you, David, before I come to you, Takura. What conversations should African leaders be having? What conversations should African business men and billionaires be having? What conversations should the African people be having on, the global economy as it concerns energy shocks?
So I think the first conversation, most important conversation that needs to be had among the African people is the basic realization that Africa suffers from energy poverty, and that's the only priority at this point is to expand access to energy at any and every cost.
Okay.
So anyone who is coming out with these foreign sponsored narratives about exploring fossil fuel is bad for the environment. Africa is hardest hit by climate change, so Africa shouldn't do this or do that. You need to take those people and, as you said, put them in the rehabilitation center. That's where they belong. Right?
I think we're going to have No, go ahead, David.
If you need Africa's economies, if you need Africa's economies to grow, to develop, you need them to industrialize. You can't industrialize without power. So Africa has some of the most cheapest and largest energy reserves that are just lying fallow, that are not being used. It might surprise you to know that Somalia, right, that you only think of as a place where like there are wars and fish and stuff. Somalia has far bigger oil reserves than Nigeria. It might surprise you to know that. Most of Africa is a huge reserve of energy that is not being tapped, right? This is the continent that it's the crown jewel, it's the prize. So what we need to be doing at any and every cost is finding ways to harness resources under our feet for our own benefit. So in line with the so-called Lagos Declaration, where the focus was on intra-African trade and constructing industries with a focus on trade amongst ourselves. Those are the conversations that should be had, not conversations about what some guy in DC is funding someone in Nairobi to put out, the environmental this, or someone saying that Africa doesn't need so many graduates, and that instead Africa should focus on strengthening its supply chains for raw materials, right? All those are foreign narratives that are designed to further the
not just foreign narratives, David. I actually think that it's an offensive narrative to think that all we are worth to the global economy or the global community is an extractive industry. So what's the difference between that and working in a plantation when all you do is just produce, extract, and leave the industrialization to the others.
I'm sure Lonzen knows this, but I'm just quickly going to add, in 1986, if he recalls, I say he recalls as if I was there, but it was actually a meeting, I believe it was in Harare, where the World Bank basically gathered the education ministers, was it the finance ministers of African countries, and told them that they need to shut down their universities. The global market doesn't need highly educated Africans, basically. That higher education, tertiary education is too expensive for Africa. We can't afford it. And they should rather focus on bolstering their exports. And exports is the euphemism for raw materials. So basically, we don't need African brains. We need African cashew nuts. That's what Africa is for.
And we need African hoes and cutlasses and hands. We need African bodies to dig the ground and go into the mines and extract. Anyway, last word from you, Takura. What's your take on this? What conversations should we be having?
Yeah, your question is a very pragmatic one. Conversations and actions obviously should happen almost simultaneously where they can. And there have been frameworks already established, at least with the African Union under Agenda 2063. We should be able to explore what opportunities are there, particularly for colleagues like David's, young colleagues who were not there in 1986 in Harare. But yeah, I think the Agenda 2063 of the African Union is a very important starting point around energy, at least. And I remember also that it is the former Nigerian president who actually initially brought up the issue of fossil fuels, and how Africa has nothing to do with being a polluter. It's like less than 2%. I think that was Olusegun Obasanjo, correct me if I'm wrong, colleagues, who mentioned it. I think it was at an energy conference, either somewhere in a European country or somewhere in South Africa. I'm not sure. So clearly we also have to talk back to the global north about the fact that we are not polluters. Yeah? And we should be able to explore our own minerals, our own oil, and anything else, as long as it benefits our people democratically, as long as we don't have power cuts, as long as we don't have power shortages. And that is another big talking point. We have to retake narratives beyond what is told to us via mainstream global media, and now via algorithms, whether it's TikTok, Twitter, which is privately owned. I keep telling young Africans that, no, your Facebook account is not yours. And people say, no, it's mine. Get off my Facebook account. I'm like, no. It's not yours, comrade. It belongs to Elon Musk. It belongs to Zuckerberg. And we need to counter these narratives a bit more, whether it's in relation to oil and energy, but also in relation to war.
Yeah.
Because as the initial topic of this conversation is, how does global conflict affect Africa's political economy, particularly around oil and oil supplies, as well as even food supplies, wheat, maize, as it comes from either Latin America or from Eastern Russia, Eastern Europe, and rice as it comes from Asia itself. And every time there's a war, there's going to be a shortage somewhere in Africa, a global conflict, even if it's isolated to a region.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Takura, for your contribution. Final word, Lonzen, before we say goodbye.
Yeah, we need to diversify our energy sources.
Yeah.
And we must insist that we will diversify. We cannot be directed in one direction by anybody. That's number one. Two, but generally speaking, we need to get out of the structural vulnerability in which we exist if we are to prevent our being victims in the next crisis, which it will come. So, to be able to do that, we need to build resilient economies. And these resilient economies, they can only be resilient when they are inward looking, not serving an external purpose. Yeah. And they must also be interlinked. So it must be an integrated African economy where a resilient national economy is interlinked to a regional integration, and where regional integration comes together to build a truly integrated African economy, the way you see the Chinese economy, the way you see the American economy, the way you see the European economy. So this is the kind of resilience that can let us solve the structural vulnerability. Without it, we'll be always waiting for charity that will be done for us in the moments of volatility. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much for that last word. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Takura, thank you for standing in for Levy. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast today. Thank you, David. And thank you to our very own listeners and everyone who tunes in every time we upload a new episode. Remember to click the subscribe button. And if you haven't shared this with any of your friends, please do so. Join us same time next week for another episode of Africa Aspirations. My name is Fola Folayan.